I need some traction. You need some traction.
Hey everyone, Lloyd Lobo here, co-founder at Boast AI. Today's Traction webinar is brought to you by Boast AI Launch Academy in partnership with Product Collective, the top community for product leaders. And I'm super excited to have my friend Mike here, who runs Product Collective, to take it away. We have a great session on team health between Mike and Jon at Netflix. So Mike, without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Lloyd, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'm Mike Belsito. I'm the co-founder of Product Collective. And Product Collective is a community for product people. And if you're a product manager, if you're an entrepreneur, working in maybe other roles in tech, chances are you might identify with being a product person. And those are usually the types of roles that are of the people in our community. And so we do a number of things. We host our own video chats. I co-host a podcast called rocketship.fm, which, gosh, I think we've had now over 500 episodes. We have a weekly newsletter that goes out every Friday. And we have a conference series, Industry, the Product Conference. In fact, we've now done coming up on 11 editions of Industry. Most of those were in person. Of course, during COVID times, we started running virtual editions of Industry. And it turns out that this October 5th and 6th, coming right up, we have our third virtual edition of Industry, where it's 2 days. There's 12 keynotes from people like Ken Norton, formerly of Google, now a big-time product coach. Lenny Rachitsky, creator of Lenny's newsletter, which if you're a product person, it's one of the go-to newsletters, at least that I like to read. And we have product leaders from TikTok, from Asana, so many more, Peloton. So you can check out details at industryconference.com/virtual. And if you use the code REWIND50, you actually save $50 off on your pass, and ticket prices go up a little bit on October 1st, since it's coming right up. So you'll save even more if you register before then. But yeah, that's what we're up to at Product Collective. Most of what we do, you don't have to pay a dime for, to get involved with the newsletter, the video chats, anything like that. So go to productcollective.com, check it out. I hope to see you involved with what we've got going on. But I love doing sessions like this where I get to talk to product leaders from around the world, like we have with us today, and I get to learn because, look, I'm no product expert. I love putting myself in the same company as product expert, so to speak, but I really love learning and I really love asking my own questions. And today we're digging in on a topic that I've been curious about, which is product team health, and what does it really mean, and how can we do a better job at cultivating it? How can we do a better job of maintaining that? And so we have a guest that could really dig in on that with us. Before I introduce him, though, I just want to kind of repeat what Lloyd said before. If you have questions at any time, maybe you came to this session with questions of your own already, load them up in that Q&A section. I have questions of my own for our guests, but I want to get to as many questions of yours as possible, and we have time for as many of your questions as we can. Anyway, with all of that, I want to get right to introducing our guest, and it's somebody that I've been in touch with for the last year and a half or so. I know we featured him on one of our episodes of rocketship.fm, and it's Jon Bell of Netflix. And Jon, it's really good to get to be face to face with you finally.
Yeah, it would be better in person, but like you said, COVID times not allowing us to be in person, but yet face to face. It's good to be here.
For sure. And by the way, I see in the chat there are people from all over joining us. And Jon, I guess speaking of which, where in the world are you tuning in from today?
Yeah, my wife and I like to say we're a little homeless right now. We're typically based in the Bay Area, but for the last 7 months, we were in the Midwest in Iowa, where her family is, so our little boys could spend some time with their cousins and grandparents. And for the last couple months, we've actually been in Florida. So we found sort of a remote spot where we could sort of be alone with the water, get out of the Midwest, escape the summer heat there for a little bit, and enjoy some beach time. So headed back here in a couple of weeks.
That's awesome. Very cool. Yeah, that is one of the nice things that it's hey, we have to look for like the small things throughout these pandemics.
Totally, silver lining.
Small things to appreciate, but the ability for us to go out and enjoy different places while still working, that's definitely something to be grateful for.
And I will say I've been quite thankful for the both having a job and maintaining a job through these times, but also having something to keep my mind active and busy while we're sort of stuck at home. So.
For sure. For sure. Well, speaking of your job, maybe it'd be good just to start to give everybody a, kind of like the 1-minute intro of who you are and kind of what got you into your role at Netflix, like sort of what brings you here today.
Sure. Great question. So I work at Netflix currently as a product lead on our consumer team. And I'm currently working in sort of the fandom space. So making Netflix has traditionally been focused on streaming of long form content, video content specifically. And right now I'm working on sort of a new experience focused on enabling fans to further engage with the content that they love most. So it's been a wonderful, delightful experience so far. Started this year. Plan on launching in the next few months, but it also necessitated starting a team from scratch, which I found myself doing throughout most of my career, both my technical product career, but also my prior career, which you and I were chatting about a little bit earlier, of leading political campaigns. So building teams from scratch, and I think it's in particular building a new team during COVID has led to me thinking quite a bit about not just what does physical health, mental health, and social health look like, but what does team health look like? And so happy to talk about some of that. Now, in the past, I've sort of done a wide variety of things in my 13, 14-year career in tech. Done design, product marketing, and product management, and have largely led teams. I've worked at companies of small, medium, and large startups, no particular industry focus. Worked in ed tech, consumer entertainment, SaaS, enterprise. I've sort of, lacked a little bit of focus, but I like to think that I'm sort of curious and like to dig in on new, interesting challenges and work with great people. And so far, my career has afforded me that opportunity.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I think for a lot of product people, it is like, chances are, if you say, hey, rewind 10 years, like, did you know that you're going to be in the position you're in right now? Most people would have no idea. It's like everybody's taking their winding path to get into product management differently, maybe. But it is interesting. And by the way, your new role is intriguing me very much. And it sounds like probably one of those roles you can't talk about quite yet all the way, but I can't wait to learn more about what that's going to be all about.
We'll chat next year about it after it's launched.
That's perfect. Well, why don't we dig right into the topic, which you already alluded to, which is we talk about the health of our products a lot as product people, and we're always trying to stay in touch with our product health, maybe measuring it differently from company to company. We all have our own metrics, but when it comes to team health, not as many people talk about that. And I thought maybe to start, you could sort of define, what do you mean when you say something like team health?
It's a great question. I think the simplest version is, the well-being of the individuals who make up your team. And we just talked about sort of there can be different lenses or paradigms on that. There's sort of the mental, the physical, the social, but there's also this additional element, which is, how do the interactions between the people on the team lead to, a greater sense of sort of accomplishment and fulfillment and well-being. And so I think of team health as really being about the intersection of the various different people. So how the people themselves fit together and care for each other, and how that yields a result that's less about, in my case, I think it generates business outcomes, but it's less about business outcomes, and it's really motivated by a care for the other human beings on the team. Whenever I join a team, try to go out of my way to basically say, look, like this role, this team, this job, they'll all go away inevitably. It's like this taboo you don't really talk about, but it's true and continues to persist. But the relationships that we have with individuals at the end of the day, that's sort of the only thing you kind of take away from a company that's of any enduring value. You add things to your resume. As your resume grows, the value of those things diminishes. You create impact for the business, whatever, impact and business mean very abstract notions. And it's good to be proud of all of those things. But, at the end of the day, it's the humans that you care for within your company that you'll probably take sort of the most enduring value from. And so team health is really this idea of being intentional about that, and creating the conditions for those interactions and those sort of healthy relationships to develop. And then again, I do think that, what flows out of that are things like, healthy conflict, right? Or people's willingness to be, more humble. So you get a little less arrogance, a little less friction. So there are plenty of, outcomes or results that yield good business impact or business results. But I generally think of team health as being motivated by sort of a genuine care for the other people on your team.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that take on it. And by the way, we already got one audience question right out of the gate that actually is,
Sure.
It's kind of right in line with what we're talking about now. So I'll pull this audience question in now. And by the way, keep those audience questions coming. I'd love to get to as many of them as I can in this session. But you talked a little bit about the why, about why it's so important for team health, why we should be paying attention to it. Their question is, when is it necessary for us to be paying attention to? So it's a good question. Is this something that there's certain times where we need to be maybe caring more, or is it we should be from minute one to the very end? So what's your take on it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I think if you think about sort of the definition that I'm going with around this idea, sort of genuine care for the individuals on your team, it should be persistent and constant. It should sort of be present. Now, there may be moments or conditions where it's more important to be intentional about what I refer to as a duty of care than others. The product development, we'll call it life cycle, has ebbs and flows in, for instance, how much stress it might create in the lives of the folks on your team. There are externalities or external events. We're in one right now, COVID as an example, that you might be aware of that create strain in somebody's life. And so you might sort of pay acute attention to sort of that duty of care around team health in those moments. So it's not to say that there aren't moments when you sort of lean in a little bit more. But I definitely think it's something that should be present at all times, and something that as a product leader you should be cultivating. So I'm regularly thinking about how can I demonstrate to my team that I care, and then how can I make that caring count? Because I like to say it's not enough to have a good intent. You want a good outcome. And so we're all good product people. We think about measurement, etc. So not just intent. So I think those are two things I'm constantly holding in my mind. And then there are moments. Right now we're considering, for instance, back to office or sort of location of work and things like that. And so this is a moment when duty of care is really top of mind for me. Beyond policies, beyond shipping, etc. We're really thinking about how does the approach that we take as leaders on this team affect all of the people working on this effort and their lives, their kids, their families, etc. And we take measures designed to ensure that they are healthy and happy. And then secondarily say, how do we deal with the consequences for shipping product? So again, something you should always be cultivating. And then you'll find sort of these moments where you have to lean in and pay more acute attention to team health. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. Yeah, and it was a great question. So like I said, keep those questions coming, please. I'm curious if there are maybe common misconceptions, sort of myths, when it comes to product health. Again, it's not a topic that a lot of people necessarily are outwardly talking about, but at the same time, it's an important one. So I'm just curious if even the way people do talk about these topics, are there misconceptions we should be aware of?
Yeah. So there are two that jump out at me immediately, and maybe more will come to me as I think about it. One actually relates to a question that I just saw come through around, what initiatives without overwhelming people, what can we do without overwhelming people to sort of maintain the health of the team? And so there's sort of two that are somewhat related that come to mind. One is this idea that team health is the responsibility of other people. If you work at a medium to large company, there are people whose jobs it is to sort of think about culture and the sort of overall health of the people that employed at the business. These may be HRBPs. This may be people, in HR, in training, people managers, right? A lot of product leaders aren't people managers. And so, but work on cross-functional teams, matrix teams, where you work with a bunch of engineers. Those engineers have an engineering manager, and part of the engineering manager's job is to make sure that those engineers are doing the best work of their lives and enjoy working at the company. And they talk about these things in their one-on-ones, et cetera. So one common misconception, I think, is that this is handled by other people for whom it is in their job description. And me thinking about this as well is sort of redundant. And that is true. That doesn't, though, negate the fact or counter the fact that PMs can have an outsized impact. And I'll talk about this in just a second. The second is that everything needs to be an initiative. Demonstrating care is free. It's relatively easy once you get over the sort of personal psychological hurdles and some of the like artificial social constructs that keep us from just demonstrating just sort of like a warmth and care for our colleagues, especially in environments where we're all trying to get a lot done and demonstrate how smart we are. It's really hard to get through that, to just say, like I like to say, just ask the second question. So how are you? How was your weekend? Someone shares, great. How was yours? Oh, yeah, we did this, we did that. We went to the beach, we did the other thing. All right. So, what's top of mind for you today? And you just move on. It's like, you got the perfunctory, how are yous out of the way, literally just asking the second question. Tell me more about that. Or how was that for you? Or were there any challenges? Or, that second follow-up question is so easy. It's free. And it takes people back. They go, because they were ready to move on, because they've got the same script that we all have in corporate America. they know that we're not supposed to ask the second question, and we're not supposed to actually care about each other. We're supposed to get stuff done. And so asking the second question often just shakes people out of the normal go with the flow mode. I've had people break down and start crying on that second question. It's just like, oh my gosh, like, actually. And then you start to hear, and literally just listening can be a ministry and a service in and of itself to folks on your team. It can be therapeutic, et cetera. So I just, that conception that like everything needs to be a program, we have to have these team celebrations, we have to have these offsites. Oftentimes that is like overwhelming. Sometimes that is burdensome. Sometimes you'll degrade your health because you're trying to manage all of these other things on top of your day job to make sure that the team is healthy. And so I guess my note on this is that it's actually relatively easy, and some of the easiest things are the most meaningful. So sometimes I'll make a note to myself to hop on a call on my one-on-ones and just tell someone that they're doing a great job. That's another one of those things that sometimes catches people off guard. It's just like, oh, how often do you have someone get on a one-on-one with you that's not your manager and spend the first, let's say it's 30-minute meeting, spend the first 10 minutes telling you how meaningful you are in their life, how thankful you are that you're on their team, how much they've learned from you, and how much they look forward to the future of working with you. That's a huge gift. That can make somebody's month.
It costs
and it doesn't
nothing.
and it costs you nothing. It costs you literally the intention. So yeah, those are two. Is it the responsibility of others to maintain team health? Absolutely. It's also yours. Is it expensive, or does it have to be sort of overwhelming? It doesn't. It can be relatively easy and have a huge impact. It just requires a little intention.
That's great. That's great. And I mean, one of the things I love is that, it's good advice for us as product people, product leaders. It's also just good advice, like period, right? Like that's something, I mean, the second question is something you could use when you're on a conversation, having a conversation with your mother or your spouse at home, or like, we should all be asking more second questions, right? And third and fourth and so on. But yeah, so I love that. Thank you for that, Jon. Somebody asked the question, which I love this question too, and I had it on my list. But it's funny because we're talking about these topics, and these are real, like we're trying to be real people with our colleagues, mm-hmm. But at the same time, we're product people, so we love to measure. So the question was like, are there specific measures, that you use to kind of gauge team health, team happiness?
Yeah. So look, we're product people. So part of what we do is take in quantitative data. A lot of what we do is take in qualitative data. And frankly, the majority of what we do is synthesize from lots of inputs. And I think team health is frankly no different. I've worked on teams where we actually publish little surveys. There are a bunch of tools around this now. I tend to not like to get super fussy with the tools, so I'll use like a Google form. I'll ask I'll sort of do an informal survey. I won't tell people I'm surveying, but I'll just take, my one-on-ones for a month and ask the same series of questions, and then just sort of apply sort of a qualitative score. So I won't say, hey, score yourself on a scale of 1 to 7, but I'll just ask the same question and then gauge the reaction and do my own tabulation. I like, taking sort of quantitative and turning it into some sort of quantitative output. I will often go and talk to people's managers as another source or sort of input. So on the quantitative side, surveys, there's lots of materials out there around how you could structure these surveys. I generally suggest that you make them simpler and rather than more complex, that you do them relatively infrequently. So people don't want to answer surveys all the time. Like that is feels very inhuman to like get a notification from Google Forms asking you how you feel. You can almost anticipate that there's some sort of program outcome that's going to come from that. It's very different than someone demonstrating that they have genuine care for you as a person. Your mom probably doesn't send you a survey asking you how you're doing on a scale of 1 to 10. She probably just texts you and says, hey, how's it going? And then you say, oh, I'm all good. And she says, well, no, really? Right. So it's like there's a level of like, you can't productize this because we're talking about humans, although there are some tools that you can use to gather some data. So and then on the qualitative side, I guess there's a question of like, are there heuristics that you can use or signs or signals that you can look for? And so that's what I tend to focus on. One, this is just like active listening and paying attention to body language. You can just, again, make a note, say like, look, for the next 2 weeks, I'm just going to sort of take a note down in each of my one-on-ones on people's body language. Is it positive, neutral, and negative? If it's largely positive and you have a few negatives, that means you should probably follow up with those 2 individuals and say, hey, you seemed a little off. Or, hey, is everything okay? You're usually, and I like to, frankly, when I ask this question, I'll talk about this as well, because I think part of what we just need to do on a constant basis is ask the uncomfortable questions, and saying like, hey, you seem tired is like probably not a great way to like open. Like, no, this is just my normal face. Sorry, it disappoints. But, I've said, for instance, to engineers, say like, hey, you usually have a really, you usually proactively contribute and have a pretty optimistic perspective. And I've noticed, you've been pulling back a little bit more. And your perspectives seem a little bit more sort of neutral or tactical. Is that intentional? Is anything going on? Anything I can help with? Just thought I would check in. So there are ways of sort of checking in without making it sort of like a big deal. But yeah, so I'd say, you can sort of do this through your one-on-ones, develop your own sort of behind the scenes system for gauging people's body language. And then, I like to ask people, I ask a bunch of questions that people are always like, oh, no one's ever asked me that before. And I don't know why. So I feel like I'm breaking this fourth wall of corporate America or something. Like I don't know why people, for instance, I like to ask my managers, like, like, hey, what's next for you in your career? I'll ask senior VPs this question. They're just like, what? Like, no one asks me that. But like, yeah, I'll ask people, say, hey, how do you think the team is doing? And people go, oh, I think the team is doing great because of these reasons, those reasons. Or actually, did you know so-and-so is going through X, Y, or Z? So it's just a little bit of like farming for like what's happening, farming for gossip a little bit, but in search of that kind of like, how is the team actually doing? That maybe someone won't tell you to your face. So those are a couple ways that you can sort of gauge qualitatively where is my team. And if you want to apply a score, you can do that. If you want to classify, you can do that. But I think that's all on you, and most of the other product management toolkit things probably work in those contexts as well.
Yeah, no, I like that. I was curious, now that it sounds like a lot of those things you're mentioning can be done now in this remote world. But I've just been thinking the last year and a half, and some companies have always been remote, but many companies are now, they've been thrust into this remote world that maybe they're not used to interacting with their team members or just being able to get a general feel for how things are going when we're all behind our computers. Do you have any specific advice when it comes to that now, us being in this remote world?
It's a great question. I don't, I do feel like I'm going to need to spend some more time thinking specifically about the unique conditions of sort of remote, distributed, and hybrid. I think location of work has some unique challenges when we think about the conditions that they create for the team. Are all obviously all familiar with them. It's not so much that we're working from home as much as like, our home has become like, this amalgam is like where it's our office and our home. I have to parent my 4 boys and be a husband and do all of that sort of in full view of my colleagues. And I've seen some great advice on the internet, from others that have thought more deeply about this. So I don't have any remote specific things. I do tend to think that like first principles here, like, first principles answers are a little annoying because they seem really simple and like they're not that tactical. Again, I keep going back to this like concept of a duty of care. So if you start by asking yourself sort of, what does it look like to care for this individual in this moment? The answer will reveal itself, and it's going to be unique to that individual and unique to that circumstance. When you think about what can we do collectively as a team, I think that gets a little bit more sort of systematic. And I haven't done a ton of deep thinking on that in the context of remote.
No, but really, I mean, some of the things that you even brought up, just thoughts here, like you brought up one thing which made me start to think, which is the fact that when we say like, well, we're working from home. Well, working from home for one person, like for me, working from home means I'm having dueling conference calls with my wife until 3:30 when my 2 kids get home, and are usually, their favorite pastime is just like egging each other on and like getting under each other's skin. So if you're to have a call with me around 4:30 in the day, you're probably getting me at my most stressed, as opposed to if it was like 10 o'clock and the kids are at school and I'm like, okay, now I have some work ahead of me. But for some people, working from home means they're alone all day. And maybe are looking for that, being around other people and all that. So I'm just glad you brought that up, because it just, it's a fresh reminder that we're trying to look at team health, even just the time of day we're talking to people, we're just understanding their actual situation. It seems to make a big difference.
Yeah, I think, this goes back to, for instance, that, we talked about these things don't have to be expensive or elaborate. Asking that second question usually reveals a bunch of these things, right? So it reveals often over the course of time that, maybe you've got a partner that's there in the house that's working at the same time. The dog wanders in. It's an opportunity to ask like, oh, I see you have a dog. Do you have any other pets? Maybe they have lots of pets and you're just not seeing them. What do they do during the day when you're on calls? It's like, oh, it's really challenging. It's just asking that second follow-up question, treating it a little bit like research, right? Like most researchers respond to a participant by just asking another question, right? And sort of follow the thread. And so, or I should say, at least that's in my experience, been one of the differences between the great researchers I've worked with and just mediocre. They don't stick to the script. They just follow the lead of the participant. So similarly, if you follow the lead of the person you're talking to, this as the interviewer, a podcast, it's like you'll find the nugget of truth or insight. And then you can use that to round out your understanding of their environment and their conditions, and you can build healthier practices around that. One thing I think that I've been thinking about this recently. I'm into cooking, food, those sorts of things, and it's a little self-promotional, but there's a title on Netflix called Cooked, and it's Michael Pollan. He's super into sort of food and biology and sort of how do we live happier, healthier lives through food. It's interesting because there's an episode called Air, which I like to think of as the bread episode, because it really talks about how the majority of bread is actually air. So it's fascinating. If you're looking for something to watch on Netflix, I feel like this is responsibility of a Netflix product leader to always recommend something to watch on Netflix if you ever do a public appearance. It's a great watch. But what's fascinating, he makes this comment that bread is actually sort of breaks down the components. It basically goes like bread is like water, flour from wheat, and it's air. And air, while it's vital to life, can't sustain you. Water, while it's vital to life, can't sustain you. And flour, ground wheat, in and of itself is actually not even particularly digestible. Like there's not a lot of nutrition. Like you really can't get nutrition from it. But when you combine them, you can actually sustain a human life indefinitely. And that's how I think about this concept of team health. I think we have cross-functional teams. We get that flour and water and air are important, and we sort of stick them together. But if you actually don't combine them appropriately, and then create the conditions, the specific heat and baking, the time it takes to rise, and all those sorts of things, if you don't actually combine them appropriately, in a way that respects each of the ingredients and allows them not just to shine, but to contribute to the others and transform the others in a meaningful way, you don't get something that's consumable. You don't get something that's valuable. So we like to think in product about this idea of sort of 1 + 1 = 3, and how to sort of the sum of the parts really create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. But it's like, well, what is it that does that? And I think for a lot of people, they like to turn to process. I think a lot of process is designed to try to solve for or systemize a breakdown between people. And so, like, at Netflix, talk about people over process, this idea of context over control. And a lot of our principles of how we get things done is basically saying, let's remove a bunch of the artificial constructs associated with trying to get work done. Let's put people together and say, look, you understand what you're trying to accomplish. You're adults. Like, communicate with each other, care for each other. Selflessness is one of our core values. It's like, if you do that, you'll get great outcomes, and you can actually cut a bunch of the process designed to remove a lot of the agency associated with just being humans interacting together. So, and that's where, if we talk about creativity and collaboration and where does innovation come from, it's that spark when people get together and they feed off of each other and they brainstorm. And so it's weird because we have these contradictions. We're all trying to do innovation, but then we use these processes that sort of remove exactly the thing that's special about people being together. And that's, these communication protocols or these steps and these processes, and we focus on the work and stop focusing on each other. Anyway, it's an interesting, I think, sort of metaphor, but it's one I've been thinking about recently. It's just like, wow, yeah, water, air, and flour, all wheat, all naturally occurring, all independently valuable, but like can't actually sustain a human indefinitely. But when they combine in just the right way, you basically have a source of nutrition forever.
I think that's a great metaphor, and it takes time, right? It's like when you're baking that bread, it takes time for it to rise. I don't know, I might not speak the baker's terms, but I know
Sure,
there's something
yeah.
about rising, right? But it's sort of
Yeah.
same with the teams. I just think about where you're not going to step into that team day one and be like, okay, I had a good conversation with everybody. We're solid as a team. Even that takes time to really develop and sort of build up, I imagine, right?
100%.
Love that. There's an audience question. Actually, I will answer a question that somebody asked before myself, which was they stepped away for 1 second and they said, hey, I keep hearing Jon mention the second question he likes to ask. What was the question? And it really could be anything, right? Like talking about that second question. It was just the notion of digging in more with people and not just the surface, like, hey, how's it going? But really digging in more. Did I kind of summarize that okay?
Yeah, I think you did, and I do have a bunch of examples of things that I use, and so I'll offer
Let's go
some
into
of those
that.
here. Yeah. So one of my favorites, I talk about this idea of asking, in corporate America, there's a lot of talk about the inappropriate things that you shouldn't be saying. And sometimes I think things that are uncomfortable sort of get lumped in. It's like, oh, we're just not going to ask anything. We're just not going to say anything.
Mm.
And so I like to say, ask the uncomfortable question, not the inappropriate one. And they're very different. And it's important that we don't shy away from the uncomfortable questions. And no, I don't mean the sort of like, ask the why question for the 17th time, that product managers are constantly doing. So one example of a question series that I did with my team last year is I just started an email and I said, look, I care about you all deeply. Work has a sort of constantly rushing through things. So I'm going to start an asynchronous thread, tech terminology and jargon, but basically I'm going to start an email with 3 questions. Voluntarily, anybody who wants to answer it can reply to this thread with answers to these questions. I'll go first. And the 3 questions were, what's something challenging in your life right now? What's something beautiful in your world right now? And it was challenging, beautiful, something you're obsessed with right now. And so, the one condition was it can't be work related. And, I shared in the opening, to give you an example, I shared that I struggled a little bit with some political differences between my in-laws and me, and we were staying with our in-laws during COVID. They were struggling with some health things, and we wanted to be close and present and there to help and serve them. And so I obviously knew that was the point of being there, and I really didn't want our political differences to get in the way of us doing that. And I was struggling because I was trying to support my wife, who was also being gracious and dealing with this, and I was dealing with it and trying to do work. And it was relatively early in the pandemic, and everyone was stressed out and had no idea what was going on. And so that was one of the things that I was struggling with. And so just sharing sort of struggles with in-laws. I shared about spending time with my boys. I was obsessed with this new drone that we had gotten, and that was just every day after work. That's what we were doing, flying this drone around, taking videos, etc. The outcome, though, is it's remarkable. That thread continued for 6 or 7 months, and people would just occasionally, I'd completely forget about it. And then someone would say, "Hey, I've been reading these. I've been crying as I read these. I've been wanting to weigh in, haven't found the time." And they just pop in. It'd be a couple of weeks and someone just pop in. We heard about divorces. We heard about sickness. We heard about so many things that it was moving to believe that that the team was willing to share these things with each other. Like, we don't talk about these things in team meetings. And it was a way for us to very simply, again, and this is a sort of asynchronous, like, I'm just going to start a thread, but like, ask that uncomfortable question, like, what's something challenging in your world right now? And they have complete agency to determine what they want to answer with. It could be trivial, it could be funny. There were some funny stuff, but I think it brought the team closer together. It wasn't even a sort of real-time face-to-face conversation. And it's just the type of question you don't really ask. You might ask, "Hey, do you have any blockers?" And that's work-related, and it's tactical, it's project-based. But what's challenging in your life right now? Like, why ask that question? It's because I care. And it's one of those questions that immediately demonstrates that you care. But something beautiful that forces you to sort of take a very different lens on life, right? Which is like, oh yeah, what are the things that I view as joyful or beautiful in my world, and helps me get to know you a little bit better. So anyway, that's an example of sort of one, activity, another one of those cheap activities, if you want to call it an activity, or questions. What are you obsessed with? What's something that's beautiful in your world right now? What's something that's challenging in your life right now?
I love that. And this was basically a running email thread. Is that what it was?
Yep. I just sent it to my team's DL, and I don't know, we probably had 80 people on it, and yeah, people just kept responding for months. It was fantastic.
I like that. Thank you for bringing up that example. That's definitely helpful. I'll go to another audience question here. Somebody asked the question, team participation. It's a critical piece. They're wondering if you had any advice for getting folks that might be less prone to participate in these team activities to engage. It sometimes, especially if things being remote, might be hard to determine, is this an introverted person, or is there something maybe deeper we need to dig in? What would be your advice to the person asking this question?
It's a fantastic question. I'm relatively extroverted. I'm in a leadership position. And so I recognize that my mode is often different than other people's modes. I'm usually proactive. I'm a Enneagram 7. If you're into Enneagram, I like to do stuff, like to change it up, mix it up. And frankly, I've been on some teams where that is just not how most people are. So my advice here is twofold, and it might feel a little contradictory, but I'm going to basically suggest that you use some judgment and some trial and error here. So the first is not any different than what we do in product, which is like, look, know your audience, get to understand your audience. If you view this activity as for your team, then get to know and understand the preferences and behaviors of your team. It might be that the thing that you're trying to do is just misaligned with the things that they are interested in, or it's organized in a way that they cannot take advantage of. That's on you, that's not on them. So I think it's important to, before we sort of jump to a conclusion that someone is just like, doesn't want to engage with the team or participate with the team, maybe it's that the team hasn't designed a way for them to meaningfully engage based off of who they are, not who the organizer is. And frankly, organizers tend to be pretty different than the people that they're organizing for. It's just a different mode. The second is, if you think that there might be a pretty significant difference between the things that you tend to want to do or the way that you tend to operate, enlist somebody else who seems more similar to the other folks on the team to both come up with ideas, lead, and organize, and you offer them your support. Sometimes it's a matter of just like it coming from somebody else. or just sort of thinking differently about the problem space. I've definitely had people propose some things. I'm like, that seems basic. And they're like, no, people like me find it fun. And I'm like, oh, okay, we'll see. And then everyone loves it, and I have to learn to enjoy it and love it. And I'm like, tell me why do y'all think this is so hilarious, or why is this so much fun? And so it's just a good opportunity to expand your perspective. The third, this is the one that's maybe a little bit controversial here, is that sometimes you just need to push people a little bit. Sometimes people are risk averse. I was talking to one of my former engineering leader colleagues. I took not our entire team, but a good chunk of our team, 40 plus people, several states away on we went to our call center, et cetera. But then we went and did ATVs. And she was very nervous. She was very nervous. She was like, Jon is going to get us all fired. This is just this is like ATVs. Some people are like, why can't we do something like an escape room, right? Like, why can't we do something like normal? That's sort of the idea. And I was like, no, let's get out in nature. Let's get out of our comfort zones. And that was my push. And every time, the leaders who were helping organize would come back with shouldn't we tone this back a little bit? I would push back and say, why? Why are we, has anyone said that they don't want to do this? Or is it just that we've never done this before? And on the trip, I was in one of the vehicles, and someone who was new to the team was like, does this team always do stuff like this? And one of the engineers was like, not until Jon took over the team. It was sort of this, there really isn't any reason to not do these things. We just hadn't, and so it was uncomfortable. So I think it's okay to challenge people to say, hey, look, I want you to participate because I want to spend time with you. If you're uncomfortable with this for a reason, it's okay to hear the objections and to show care and consideration. But sometimes someone just needs to champion and push through, but always demonstrating that this is about care for the team, and that their participation is meaningful and specialty. That's often what people just need to hear. It's just they want me to participate. They care about me. And look, we made it optional, and some people opted out, and we tried to create an opt-out experience that was just as fun. So anyway, those would be some, it's okay to push back and say, look, I really would love for you to be there because I want to spend time with you and get to know you. It's also okay to say, look, maybe my perspective is not the representative perspective, and lean on others to guide you into what you should be doing.
Let me ask you a question about mistakes that are typically made. And this could be whether it's mistakes you've made along the way, whether it's things that you see other people making. And we've touched up on some of these in questions I've asked before, but I'm curious if mistakes come to mind, maybe some things that we might avoid if we're trying to, think about team health for our own teams.
Yeah, I'll talk about my mistakes, or mistakes from my experience. And I think it relates to what I just shared around, some self-awareness that I might be different in preference from the folks on my team. We'll say the average of my team, using that term, but that the majority or plurality of folks on the team might have a different view or preference. So I used to sort of assume that most people didn't do certain things, ask certain questions, go to certain places, whatever, because they in corporate America, I should say, because they basically lacked the courage. It's different. It's against the grain. With all they needed was someone to advocate, to push, to enable, go, 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 go. And so I often viewed myself as this counterbalance to stasis. If the world defaults to just keeping things the same, and this is a lot of product managers where we're largely changing things, and so it's a little bit in our blood. It's to say look, the status quo was not good enough, and I would push. I think I ran into a few scenarios, but it took me a while to learn that some things are the way they are. Because they're healthy, that the status quo is not by default bad. So the way that you sort of, or for me, the way that I sort of would suss out what of the status quo is actually sort of either by design or healthy, is to spend more time listening to the folks on the team, proposing ideas, but instead of advocating for the proposal, putting the proposal out as a way to get reactions and then learning from the reactions, right? And so, this is again, I think this came through some hard feedback uh, uh, from folks that worked, on my team or reported to me. Some were tears, some were like, I can't keep up with all of this, or this makes me really uncomfortable and I can't say anything because you're the manager or whatever, and people sort of getting to the end of their rope before they sort of would share, like, you are like way over here and that's just like not comfortable, it's not helpful, it's not healthy for me. Like, I appreciate the intent, but like the impact is that you're having is very different than the desired outcome. So I've become more sensitive to, like, I still push, I still generally try to change the status quo. I try to ship proposals a lot sooner, and focus on shipping them for the purposes of feedback. And then people who provide negative feedback or critique, I try to enlist as co-creators to help sort of pivot things, right? So it's like, okay, how might we change this to accomplish the objectives that we're aligned on, but with maybe a different mode of operation? And some of those naysayers then become advocates, have probably since helped me avoid a lot of, pretty big pitfalls. I still have a pretty healthy relationship with risk, but I try to use others to sort of guide me.
Got it. Well, we have, let's see, I'm going to go to an audience question. We've got time for maybe just one or two more. Gosh, time has kind of flown by here, sort of towards the end of the session, but definitely have time for a couple more questions. So if you've got another burning question out there, try to get it in now. But this is a good one, and it's a tricky one. The question is, what happens if you've got a sort of bad apple, so to speak? Maybe there's somebody that bringing down the team. Maybe they are unhappy, they're burnt out. Maybe they got one foot out the door. Maybe their attitude is just, it's not where you would hope it would be. And it's a clear indication that they're, if you're trying to look at team health, like for this person, right, it's not checking up right. What do you do? What do you do in this sort of scenario?
Yeah, I love this question. I'm going to tell you right now, there are no easy answers, and there's like, I don't know that all relationships don't resolve well. And I think there's just a level of humility, especially when we're providing advice on how to engage in these scenarios, that's really important. There are relationships at every company I've worked with or worked at that have been less than healthy or negative and have not resolved themselves. And I still to this day struggle with that. I was struggling with that this morning. I was just like, man, how is it that I spent all this time with this person and tried and just like, it just never resolved? So take my advice with a grain of salt. Maybe there's a book, maybe there's a method out there somewhere. If you find it, please share it with me, because I've not found one that's foolproof. So I can only offer what I try to do. One, I think it's important to surface objections early. It's one of the reasons why I just talked about ship a proposal, seek reactions as quickly as possible. Netflix as a company, we're very feedback oriented, and it's really helpful to get that feedback early, because it will sort of give you, I talk about mapping the emotional topology of like a group. Like, I really want to understand, where am I going to run into pitfalls if I try to push something forward? So, ship early, seek feedback. When you find that, bad apple, I don't know, when you apply the lens of empathy, there's probably something that's motivating their opposition. You feel that opposition in a sort of moralistic way, which is like, you're doing this because you're essentially a bad person, or at least no fun. But the reality is, like, they're another human being, and you're probably that person to them or to somebody else, and they're probably goals that they're trying to accomplish for reasons that you don't know, or conditions that they're dealing with that are invisible to you. That said, sometimes you can't get past those things. I have tried to demonstrate an extra amount of care with people for whom I sort of butted heads on things like this, just to make it 100% clear to them, I have nothing against you as a human being, and I actually care for you deeply as a human being, and I want you to be a success. And this relationship is not healthy for us or for the team, etc. I think it is extremely risky, we'll talk tactics, to try to subvert or sideline somebody who is actively trying to sabotage the team. I know it seems like the logical thing to do. Typically what it does is it drags the team into politics, and it festers and it grows. And so, in my experience, the best thing to do is, one, to demonstrate to them, look, I care for you and I want to get over this. Second is to actually confront them and say, like, in a negative sense, if you feel like, look, I've tried, to literally say, look, I think I've told somebody at some point, I'm like, look, I have tried my hardest. I think you just don't like me, and just stopped. And just like, well, why do you think that? I'm like, well, here are a couple of instances. I'm not going to rail on you, but like, here are a couple of things that, and then it was like, well, I don't have anything against you as a product leader. I don't have any, I just think, and then they went off on like all of these things that I didn't know that they thought. And the reality is the clearing the air was helpful, and it got us to what I'll call like even. It didn't get good. Like, it hasn't gotten good. Like, it's probably never going to get good. But just calling it out and confronting it head on was enough to go, look, I don't have anything against you. We see the world very differently. Like, let's sort of agree to disagree, and try to be, cordial and functional in this relationship. But it doesn't go much further. I have done the opposite. We talked about this. My first career was in politics. I have done the subversive. I have done the, how do we sideline this person? How do we go around them? How do we, et cetera, et cetera. It's not healthy. It's not, beyond not being healthy. It demonstrates, like, everyone's watching, and it demonstrates poor leadership, as people know, oh, this is how they're going to treat me if I disagree with them. So I think it's frankly just best to try to like have it not affect you. Once you've confronted it, just say, look, I'm just gonna, this is part of my lot. Like, everything can't be perfect. This is just one of the challenges I'm gonna have to deal with. I know it's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but
it's a tricky,
yeah.
It's a tricky question, right? So no, I appreciate you giving your take. I am curious, and somebody asked this, what happens if that sort of negative energy is coming from your manager? That sort of adds a whole new layer onto it. Does your advice change, or kind of is it different?
Look, this skews into career advice. It's really hard to make progress on just about anything if your manager's not on your side. Like people severely underestimate the value of a good manager. It is the thing you should quit your job if you find a great manager, or if you spend too much time under a bad manager. It's clear that your manager is just not good. Leave. Like you owe it to your sanity. You owe it to your career in the long run. It may be painful, maybe very hard. Take less money. Go work a second job. Contract until you can find your next gig. Start a company. Like bad managers. It is not. It is literally your life. Right? Like it is literally your life. It is not worth it. Go through all the steps, try to empathize, try to understand what unlocks this manager, what special thing can I learn from them? A tough manager is different than a bad manager. If your manager is not able to help you accomplish your goals or the business's goals through your role, and if they actively undermine, at a minimum, you want your manager to not interfere. If they actively undermine, it's time to find, come talk to me. Like I just like, get a different job. I cannot emphasize this enough. People tend to focus on the role and the company and don't focus on the manager. When you are interviewing for a role, you should be interviewing the manager. You should be understanding, how does this person move and operate in this business? How do they relate? You should be asking, hey, when's the last time the people on your team, when's the last time one of your direct reports made a decision that you disagreed with and you supported it? Right? Like, ask the tough questions to figure out if this is going to be a good manager or not, because that's everything. So again, probably not a satisfactory answer. But the reality is there's the power imbalance, and it's not one that you're going to overcome unless they're not your manager. Period.
No, I'm glad that you answered it that way. And hey, and not to be too self-promotional here too, but sort of why Product Collective exists too. It's like we exist to be a community for product people, and if anybody feels like they're in that position where they feel trapped, we have 30,000 people, 30,000 product people that are here that, we're here to support you. We're here to maybe find you that next role. So, and it does, sometimes it just takes talking to other people that are in your product world, so to speak, where maybe that new opportunity can open up for you too. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And I know we're towards the end of our time now. Soon I'm going to ask Lloyd to pop back on, but maybe Jon, just to close things out, this could be the lightning round question, so to speak. We spent a full hour talking on a whole number of things about product team health here, and sometimes you come to these sessions and it's that last thing that really sticks. Or it's just the one or two things that really stick. So if there was one big takeaway that you hope people get from this session, what would you want to stick in their mind? What would you want that to be?
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. I think it's the sort of core thesis of the whole discussion. I like to say that doctors have and physicians have a creed, sort of a code of ethics that revolves around the care for their patients. Lawyers have this concept of duty of care, and sort of you're legally bound to do what's in the best interest of your clients. I think product managers tend to think about themselves as representing the business or championing the voice of the customer. 50% of the people that quit their jobs or their companies leave because of a manager. And a lot of us understand that and appreciate that and go, yeah, people managers. But I don't think product managers recognize as probably equal to or potentially greater than the impact of a bad manager is the impact of a bad product manager on someone's desire to stay at a company. And so I think we have, both by our sort of as humans and as product managers and our responsibility as product managers, we have a duty of care to our teams to care about the health of our teams and making sure that the people on our teams can do the best work of their lives. You hear that a lot in tech, do the best work of your life. But that's less about what you're doing and more about who you're doing it with and how you're going about it. So that would sort of be my takeaway, or one point is think about yourself along with all the other things we do as product managers. Think about yourself as having a duty of care to the people who you're working with, and ask yourself every day, how do I express that and live that out?
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Those are great questions coming in. And yeah, this has been great, Jon. And Lloyd, good to see you here again as well. I'll let you
Great work. I like it when I have guest moderators on the show. It gives me some time to do other things. I just had a baby last week, so life is life is a little crazy, folks.
Wow,
Everything.
congratulations, Lloyd.
Thanks so much, Jon. Mike, what's the link to your conference coming up?
Yeah, you could go to industryconference.com/virtual. You could go right there. And if you use the code REWIND50, you'll save an extra $50. I figure I'd share that with the group here too.
Can you drop the code again?
Yeah, it's REWIND50. Rewind50.
Awesome, folks. Everything is going to be on the YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Love and peace.